solving previously unsolvable problems. C3 AI. This is Enterprise AI.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's Friday and it's 12:06. This is KUOW's Week in Review.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to Week in Review. Great to have you along with us for this hour together where we sit down or stand, I suppose, and figure out what happened this week and what it all means with my panel of journalists. I'm Bill Radke. I'm the one bundled up this week. If you're watching us online on YouTube or Facebook, you just search KUOW Public Radio there, and you can wave hello to Seattle Times mental health reporter, Esmy Jimenez. Esmy, welcome back. Great to see you.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for the wave. Publicola police accountability reporter, Paul Keifer. Welcome back, Paul.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Crosscut, editor-at-large, host of the Mossback's Northwest, Knute Berger. Hey, Knute.
Hey, Bill.
We had a dramatic weather week, power poles and trees falling down, and there was flooding and 30-foot waves in Grays Harbor. And on last week's show, I resisted the term bomb cyclone in favor of the terms wind and rain. And Knute, you were not there to support me, but I found out you're a fellow traveler on this one.
Yeah, I support you in spirit.
Thank you.
The newspapers now getting like the TV stations and overhyping every weather phenomenon that occurs.
Cranky
old river is coming.
Yeah, atmospheric river. That's true.
Atmospheric river, bomb cyclone to me, which is the meteorological version of murder hornets. Yes. Anything to get the clicks.
Oh, we're cranky. I think said pretty much the same thing last week. Did you hear about the cargo ship that caught fire off our north coast? Like 100 shipping containers fell into the ocean. KUOW's John Ryan told us that containers are now washing up on Vancouver Island beaches where a school teacher brought a field trip.
Teacher Jerica McArdle saw floor mats, boots, styrofoam, inflatable toys, Chinese checkers, even refrigerators scattered throughout the driftwood and bull kelp. She called the scene shocking and overwhelming. 2 other containers sat on the beach unopened, and more than 100 were somewhere unknown in the Pacific Ocean.
Storm damaged some of those containers on the ship, and then some chemical powder spilled and caught fire, and a couple of the containers have toxic chemicals in them, so don't go beachcombing there for those containers, okay?
Do people have memories of right after the hurricane in Japan, the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, when stuff started washing up in the exact same places and there were worries that it was irradiated?
I don't know about irradiation, but I know, there's burning tires and toxic chemicals and plenty of reasons to stay away.
Well, they tell you the winter is a good time to go beachcombing because of all the stuff that blows in from the winter storms. And you're usually thinking about, Japanese fishing floats or that kind of thing. And it's just kind of funny to think, honey, look, I got a new Frigidaire.
Yes.
1,000 rubber ducks. Yeah.
Well, today it's supposed to stop raining. Sudden clearing, like a bomb of clear skies going off this weekend. We'll have explosive clearings. So we'll look forward to that. You might see Aurora Borealis this week, I'm told. It's a magnetic bomb cyclone is possible, a geomagnetic cyclone or whatever that is, which I've never seen. I've never seen the Aurora Borealis.
Oh, really?
They're lovely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really an incredible sight. When you see it, it's hard to see it in Seattle unless you have a camera that can stay open and, capture the light just because of all the light.
You can get a similar effect if you just stay up for 3 days straight.
We'll be talking about psychedelics later in the program. Let's start our news review here with the elections. It's the final week in review before the election deadline. Knute, I know you've been wondering what happened to optimism in politics.
Well, yeah, one of the striking things, looking at it just as a generalist, is the sort of apocalyptic and in nature of all the candidates. My mailbox here at home is just stuffed with flyers every day, 4-color big pictures warning me about this candidate, warning me about that candidate. Here's what so-and-so tweeted. Here's what so-and-so put on television. It seems to me it's a particularly nasty type of campaign with a lot of money and these groups that can spend more than the candidates can, tearing another candidate down. And I mean, I can't say it's atypical in Seattle history, but I think it's sort of at an interesting point because, you know, we are in a difficult place, right? There are some really big issues that need to be dealt with in terms of policing, social justice, downtown, homelessness. I mean, they're all connected in one way or another and need to be dealt with. Seattle's been through crises before. And the one thing, if you study that, which I have done, if you study the various crises, in almost every case, the only way out is a unified big approach. In other words, everyone comes together, labor, business, social justice activists, and everybody gets on the same page and works through the problem. And the kind of, you know, so much of what you see in the campaign literature anyway is a kind of, you know, that person is bad. We're all good. Vote for my slate. Don't vote for, you know, it's a very kind of Manichaean approach. And I don't think the voters accept that. I think Seattle voters are more, you know, tend to be pick and choose. I mean, with local elections, you may have personal experience with a candidate and you can say, yeah, I really don't agree with that person a lot, but they have great character or whatnot. You know, people don't necessarily vote just by these wedge issues.
Esmy, you were talking about the sort of culture war when it comes to, just for example, the Seattle City Attorney election.
Absolutely. There was a Seattle Met piece that I thought kind of encapsulated that really well. That was just pointing out, like, listen, this is not just happening in Seattle. This is happening in communities across the U.S. where candidates to distinguish themselves move further left or move further right, and say, no, definitely not that guy, but this me, pick me. And then the other thing that I've been thinking about is just the money. Like Seattle Times just had a piece that was looking at $3 million. That's what's been spent with PACs this year on these elections alone. Like, what would $3 million do for community-based organizations or anything else?
Yeah, PACs, political action committees, and Paul, since we're talking about the
one second.
Okay,
hold on. I'm having a background noise thing.
Okay, we're dealing with it.
Oh Lordy. There we go. Okay. Sorry. Back online.
So regarding the Seattle City Attorney election, we were talking about this. So the candidates are very different, which maybe you can recap. But I'm wondering, can either of these different candidates make the city attorney job as different as they say they will?
Well, on some level, a lot of it will come down to how much the city council thinks that it can you know, impose X or Y policy goal onto an independently elected office. And the way that, you know, the thing that we're looking at right now that came up in this budget amendment process is diversion, which means it's a part of the city attorney's criminal unit that deals with trying to track people out of court or out of prosecution.
Paul, just for those not following it as closely as we are, maybe we should set up that one candidate wants a far more aggressive prosecutorial stance in the city attorney's office than the other. Very different.
Right. Like the key issue in the city attorney's race is whether to prosecute more misdemeanors or to direct more things to diversion, to diversionary programs like LEAD or Choose 180. And in the case of Ann Davidson, who's more skeptical of diversion, particularly for adults, the question on the mind of the city council right now, who actively supported this diversion program for years, you know, since 2017, is whether they can, as a city council, force the city attorney's office to keep those programs alive. Because right now it's entirely voluntary. Pete Holmes has agreed to these things on a voluntary basis. So what they're trying is a budget tool called the proviso, which would restrict a certain portion of the city attorney's budget to spend on diversion. And they are hoping that coupled with adding diversion to the city attorney's duties in the city code would guarantee that these programs survive. But provisos aren't perfect tools. You can still, if a future city attorney just outright does not want to support X program, they can just not spend the money instead of spending it elsewhere, which they legally can't do. So, it's hard for, it is an independently elected office at the end of the day. And there are only so many things that other branches of city government can do to influence the others. It does need to, if it would ideally operate harmoniously, but it is three separate branches of government.
When it comes to Washington state politics, our only Republican statewide office holder, I think the only Republican statewide office holder on the West Coast, is leaving us for Washington, D.C. This is our Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, going to the Department of Homeland Security. Knute, is Governor Inslee going to replace Wyman with another Republican?
I doubt it. And I'm not sure that's in his nature. But it's important, I think, that he replace her with somebody who can act on a nonpartisan basis. And if you believe Twitter, you would believe that there aren't any more people who can do that. Kim Wyman is an example of somebody who has been able to do that, as have many of the previous secretaries of state in this state. And I think that's going to be very important for credibility. I mean, the idea that he should replace a Republican because she's leaving, as some Republicans have said, of course they're going to say that, but that's just not the way the system works when the governor has the power of appointment. But I think
I thought it served Knute. I thought it served the Democrats very well to be able to point to a Republican Secretary of State, election official who supports vote by mail and who says the election wasn't fraudulent. I thought maybe a Republican in that job is good for the Democrats.
Yeah, the problem, I think, is probably finding that Republican. I think they've become fewer. The era that produced so many Republicans that were elected to statewide office of that kind are now a very small minority, I believe, within the party or within the party apparatus, certainly, which has been, heavily Trumpified, and even having a Republican in office, she's faced lawsuits from Lauren Culp, the fellow who the losing in the governor's race, and he's embraced the sort of Trump falsehoods about election being stolen and whatnot. Republicans have been unhappy with other Republicans in that office in the past. So I think it's very important to find a person who has credibility with both parties as far as that is possible these days.
Yeah. Okay. Well, people are, of course, voting right now. I'm done voting. You may well be. And your deadline is the 2nd, Tuesday coming up here. That's elections. We're going to discuss more of what's going on in the news, what happened this week, and what it all means as we continue with the Week in Review. And we are going to be right back with Esmy Jimenez and Paul Keifer and Knute Berger. Don't go away.
Sorry about that. I had a news article in the background of the autoplay ad.
Oh, no.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:20. We are heading into a dry, sunny weekend with daytime highs in the mid-50s. Chance of rain returns on Monday.
Support for KUOW comes from BNSF Railway, moving goods that help feed, supply, and power homes and businesses around the Puget Sound area and across the country. BNSF Railway, connecting the Pacific Northwest since 1873.
I'm Julian Marshall, host of BBC NewsHour. On today's programme, Pope Francis calls for radical action from world leaders at their forthcoming climate summit. Will Catholic churches around the world spread the message? And the bloody rivalry in Afghanistan between the Taliban and Islamic State.
Stay with us for BBC NewsHour this afternoon at 1 o'clock, right after Week in Review, which continues now.
This is Bill Radke. I just turned my light on in my spare bedroom here. Was that a huge difference? Can you see me way more now than before? They're on Facebook, a little bit. Let's see, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook. Use the search KUOW Public Radio, and you'll find me with the Publicola's Paul Keifer and Crosscut's Knute Berger, and the Seattle Times, Esmy Jimenez. Esmy, you report on mental health at the Seattle Times. And one of the stories you're following is the use of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin mushrooms, which the Seattle City Council does not want to prosecute as a crime. What's the story? What do psychedelics do for one's mental health?
Well, there's lots of research that stems back to the 50s, actually, very early, looking at the way that it can actually help people in different levels of crises, whether that's post-traumatic stress disorder in soldiers, vets, whether that's people going through severe depression or anxiety. Like, it's incredibly helpful when used in a therapeutic model. And so what I've been seeing and tracking is the number of both biotech companies that are starting to invest in Vancouver, Portland, Seattle, and setting up shop here locally, the kinds of clients that they're going to potentially get, and then also the research that's happening here at the University of Washington, kind of studying this. Right now, there's actually a team that's working between a private-public partnership with the UW, and they're actually trying to figure out, can we help burnout with a lot of the staff that worked on COVID, a lot of those frontline workers? Like, can we actually make sure that they don't burn out in their work through therapeutic models like psychedelics? It's still on the first trials, but we'll learn more in the coming months.
Do we understand how the psychedelics work? For example, how they compare to the way that the typical depression-targeted pharmaceuticals work? Do we understand the mechanism yet?
Totally, and it's pretty nitpicky, like it's a bunch of different things that I don't particularly want to go into, but the rough idea is there's neural pathways that are created while you're going through the psychedelic experience. So you're able to make actual new pathways in your brain, and that can actually provide healing in some cases for people where, again, either post-traumatic stress disorder, any kind of trauma, frankly, is now being able to be reconnected in a helpful, healing way. And it helps people communicate actually what happened to them.
Paul, you've paid some attention to this. Do you see psychedelics as a new medical frontier, helping the right people?
I mean, I've paid attention to it in the sense that I pay attention to, the decriminalization of any controlled substance. But at the moment, I think what's on my mind
Paul is the police accountability reporter at Publicola.
Right. Yeah. But I think what's at the front of my mind, and I think I have a question for Esmy, is that, at the moment, I kind of perceive psychedelics as sort of boutique drugs. And I don't know if there's, the thing that would kind of be the make it or break it in terms of turning psychedelics into a more widely available form of therapeutic option for people with mental and behavioral health disorders would be whether there's an economy of scale that can, whether you can scale up production of psychedelic drugs in general to make them accessible to people who are, extremely vulnerable and also don't have the money to participate in sort of a boutique market. I mean, would that then require the cooperation of large pharmaceutical companies who have the resources, and capital to launch kind of a large scale manufacturing operation?
Absolutely. I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's kind of the interesting thing that's happening in the Northwest right now. I posit we're kind of where marijuana was, 10, 15 years ago. I feel like that's where we are right now with psychedelics. And the two things that I'm seeing specifically is that, one, mushrooms are free and they're in the Northwest. Like, we just have them growing naturally here. You can actually see people coming after a rain, looking on the ground and searching for them if they know what they're looking for. There are Facebook groups online, Reddit groups online that know how to look for these and will support each other and actually being able to access them. So they're free in that sense, or someone could actually grow them in their home. With actual companies that are trying to play with psychedelics, they're trying to actually change the dosage, how long you are experiencing your actual high, right? Rather than having 6-8 hours, it might actually only be 2 hours if they're able to change that chemical compound. And we might actually be able to tailor it specifically to only provide visuals or only do X. And so that's kind of the idea with biotech companies, that they could really tailor your psychedelic experience.
Knute, any thoughts on this?
Well, honestly, I haven't given psychedelics a lot of thoughts. It's the late 1960s, and probably gave them too much thought back then. But I think that the possibilities in terms of mental health treatment with mushrooms or whatever, I think is really worthy of continued study. And you have also a lot of, experience that people have in understanding how some of these work, have for centuries. And, the fact that they may have, more kind of medical or clinical uses and could be engineered in a certain way, I think is really interesting. I'm not sure we're quite ready for everything to be legal and sort of on the streets. But it sounds like very, very, very promising research. I do want to make a mention of a new book that's out. It's a biography of a guy named Al Hubbard, who was a young man, was sort of a young techie who helped during Prohibition, helped in bootlegging. And he later became like the apostle of psychedelic drugs in the 1950s and got his hands on stuff early and was buddies with Timothy Leary and all kinds of people. But it's a really interesting book about the history of psychedelics.
So wrapping this topic up, Esmy, anything else we ought to know? What comes next? How serious the decriminalization move is in Seattle, or just what else you're working on? Anything?
There's a couple of things. So I know, for example, December 7th, there's supposed to be an event from the Entheos Society. So this is a group of people that are kind of working with some of the folks that were in Oregon, who are looking at how exactly do we bring this to the state legislature? How do we control it? How do we talk about it? What kind of laws should be there so that in 2023 or in 2025, psychedelics can actually be purchased legally for therapeutic processes or for personal reasons. So I will have more on that for sure in the coming weeks.
Very good. Looking forward to that in the Seattle Times. And we'll talk about another health issue, the COVID-19 pandemic, in just a moment. But Paul, because we were talking about decriminalizing things and you being the police accountability reporter, what's going on with is Seattle police no longer doing quote unquote minor traffic stops? What's the news on that this week?
Well, the news is that the Office of the Inspector General, back in May, recommended that SPD begin phasing out minor non-criminal or misdemeanor traffic stops, things like, driving with an expired license. And this week, the Inspector General, Lisa Judge, and the interim Seattle Police Chief, Adrian Diaz, sent a memo to the City Council and to stakeholders announcing that the Seattle Police Department is signing on, at least in theory, to the plan to start ramping down a swath of ramping down enforcement of a swath of minor traffic violations by the end of the year. There isn't a concrete plan for what those violations it will be exactly. So, the department will need to come up with some way to enshrine this move in policy. So whether that means, coming up with a new chunk of the manual that describes how to handle traffic stops involving X and Y misdemeanor infraction, or whether it means just sort of some sort of dictate from above, we don't know yet. But one way or another, it's a signal that the police department has bought into the notion that this is one way to reduce the number of civilian police interactions, which is really the goal of all of this. It's not to affect the city's revenues from civil fees. It's to reduce the number of interactions between drivers and police officers that can, in some cases, escalate to shootings like, Iosia Falatogo's death on Aurora a few years back, which started as a minor traffic stop. But, the other big, challenge in the way of all of this. Okay, so did I hear you have another question?
I was wondering, you kind of touched on this, but when I hear about police deprioritizing something, but when it's not spelled out, wait a minute, so what's illegal and what's not? It makes me wonder, how are individual officers going to make those kinds of judgments about what's minor or what's worth stopping someone for or not? It sounds like you're saying we don't know that clarity.
So the commitment that came out this week is still leaves that kind of uncomfortable gray area, right? It's a we don't entirely know what the directions to officers will be. We just know that in theory we can expect them by the end of the year. But for the time being, there's no clear guidance for officers on what should be considered minor. There's also no clear guidance on for instance, if the city needs to keep revenues from minor civil infractions, whether that means just mailing people citations more frequently instead of giving the citation in person. initially officers actually, when Lisa Judge first made this recommendation back in May, the Seattle Police Officers Guild's reaction was, the Inspector General is calling for an end to traffic enforcement in general. And they were saying that, the police department was going to stop doing DUI stops, that kind of thing. That's off the table. That wasn't even the intention to begin with, but it did create some confusion. And I think that confusion is yet to be resolved.
Hey, Paul, isn't there a problem, though, when you make these things discretionary? I was thinking back to earlier about the city attorney's office. The people of Seattle voted on an advisory thing to tell the police not to enforce marijuana laws. This was before marijuana was legalized. And so it was a message to the then city attorney not to arrest people for marijuana. And the police refused to follow that. They continued to enforce the law. And they made the argument then that, if the law's on the books, we need to enforce it. Shouldn't there be a change by statute on these things rather than a whole series of guidelines and recommendations that, where you're giving the police the excuse not to enforce laws that, they don't happen to like?
This was an argument that also came up when current King County executive candidate Joe Nguyen introduced kind of a Hail Mary bit of legislation at the end of the last legislative cycle to scale down minor traffic stops too. The question is, can you just take things like expired license infractions off the books, as opposed to, we already have these sort of intermediary fixes where, for instance, the city's municipal court has a program specifically to offer diversion for people who are arrested on quote unquote driving while poor, violations, or not arrested, but, cited for quote unquote driving while poor violations. So yeah, I think there's going to be a back and forth about whether you should say that these things are still bad and say that in the form of statute, but also, make this kind of push towards, decriminalization purely for the sake of avoiding uses of force by police officers, or whether you should just, decide to take things off the books entirely. But the latter question hasn't really been confronted head on by the city council. And for the time being, it's sort of moot because the department had to fold its traffic enforcement unit into patrol more or less because of the attrition over the past 2 years. And so it's not like these stops are happening right now in any great numbers to begin with.
Okay, Esmy, any more observations or questions about this before we talk COVID? Anything to add?
I just had a couple more questions for Paul, in the sense that, are there other things, other intangibles that come from traffic stops? Because I'm thinking, obviously I'm happy if someone doesn't stop me just because my taillight is broken or something, and maybe I didn't have enough money to fix it this week. But are there other consequences that we should be thinking about?
In some level, there's, aside from uses of force, there's also just trust. I think at the moment, the department doesn't have, and this is a whole other story that I wrote about last week, but the department doesn't have accurate data about the demographics of people who are stopped and warned or stopped and cited. And so, we can't give an exact number for, the racial disparities in traffic stops, though we know that, disproportionately Black, Pacific Islander, and Native people get stopped in the city. Reducing the number of traffic stops in an intangible sense could help increase trust. At least that's part of the thinking. But, beyond that, one of the things that people need to kind of work on piecing together out of the fragments of data that we currently do have on traffic stops is whether there is any correlation between minor traffic offenses and more serious things like DUI later on. That's something that we haven't. The likelihood of a correlation between driving with a busted tail light and driving while drunk is likely just non-existent. But in any case, there are a whole lot of questions that will be resolved by data that we don't have in a good form yet.
Okay, that's Paul Keifer, the public accountability reporter at Publicola, and we're also talking with the Seattle Times' Esmy Jimenez and Crosscut's Knute Berger, and we've gone half the show without talking about our COVID pandemic. It's obviously still here, although the Governor Inslee, says COVID cases, they've been falling for the last few weeks, but he's concerned that decline has plateaued, and he's still concerned about a possible sixth wave of infections.
So we could be seeing the start of another wave today. Do we know that for sure? We don't know that for sure, but we're concerned about it.
So in other words, the governor says, get vaccinated. This week, King County businesses started requiring proof of vaccination to get inside. Have you heard of a lot of resistance to that? I haven't heard about people boycotting businesses or fighting with vaccine bouncers. There must be some conflict somewhere, but do you know how you feel it's being received?
And for me, at least, it seems pretty easy. I've even noticed, I think there was one time that I forgot my card and I only had a photo of the first vaccine. And so I was like, oh, is this okay? And the lady was like, yeah, I trust you. I'm sure it's okay. And let me in. So I don't know exactly what the enforcement looks like from place to place. But from what I can tell, at least, going into coffee shops, bars, I went to a jazz concert 2 weeks ago. It was fine.
The state of Washington says almost 9 out of 10 K through 12 school workers are vaccinated now. I like the quote from the state school superintendent, Chris Rakedahl, talking about the unvaccinated school workers who are losing their jobs. Where is it? Yeah, here's Rakedahl talking about those folks who decided not to get the shot.
We hate to see those folks go. These are folks who are clearly committed to education. That's how they got into this, but they made a tough choice for themselves, and I want to respect that.
I want to respectfully fire you for your difficult choice. Paul, do we know how many, you're the police accountability reporter, do we know how many police officers Seattle's going to lose over vaccinations?
So we officially on October 19th lost 2, and that was kind of a womp womp moment. At least, at the, on October 19th, given that there were predictions that we were going to lose, more than 100 people immediately, it sort of seemed underwhelming. But what's sort of waiting in the wings is the issue of accommodations. And this is something that's true across the city, not just with the police department. Everyone who got an exemption from the vaccine then has to get reasonable accommodations from their department. And at the moment, every union except for SPOG, the Seattle Police Officers Guild, has an agreement with the city about how the accommodations process was supposed to work. Last week, they filed an unfair labor practice complaint with the state saying the city didn't follow those protocols because people who had received approved exemptions were getting emails saying you have been denied accommodations before they'd actually had a chance to meet with their department to talk about what accommodations could look like. On SPOG's end, there is no agreement with the city. And so there's no agreement about what the accommodations process looks like, which means we have 100 officers in kind of an unclear accommodations process who have exemptions, roughly 100. And if they don't get exemptions, if they don't get accommodations, which is entirely possible, then all of a sudden the number of people who leave could shoot up in a way that wasn't immediately clear on October 19th. That isn't a guarantee, but it's sort of a black box right now.
Did any of you see that city officials in Marysville and Mill Creek and Spokane are telling police officers, hey, you don't want to get vaccinated, come work here. We're short on officers and we're hiring. And the governor of Florida said Seattle officers who were fired for being unvaccinated might get a $5,000 bonus for coming to that state.
Yeah, there's really, one of the challenges that the police department is going to have meeting its recruitment goals is that there is a lot of demand for police officers around the state and around the West Coast in general at other departments, and the size of the recruitment classes in the basic training academy in Washington haven't grown. They're set by the state legislature, and so there are people who will likely drift over to other departments, and it'll be hard to increase recruitment classes enough to meet pretty ambitious hiring goals. So that could leave some seats vacant that the current budget estimates haven't factored in yet.
Knute, you were saying enjoy Florida.
Yeah, if you have a better job offer in Florida and you feel fine about being unvaxxed among many unvaxxed people, go for it. I just have a hard time thinking of police officers who say that their job is to protect and serve, not protecting either themselves, but especially not protecting the public. by being vaccinated. And, the mandates have largely worked. I think they're a good thing. And if people can't abide by them, I think it's good that there's an accommodations process for people to work through. But, I just have very little sympathy for people who don't want to get vaccinated because they don't want to get vaccinated.
Esmy, you were pointing out the story from the Eatonville School District in Pierce County, where they say they are not going to fire unvaccinated teachers and staff.
I mean, I'm curious about that to see exactly how that will play out. And with regards to the police officers, I was also just thinking about I wonder what the data will actually show, 6 months from now for $5,000, if that budget is even there really to do that. And at the end of the day, kind of to Knute's point, there are requirements in being in a society. I wear my seatbelt, right? I have certain, if I said I don't want to use technology anymore, right? The Seattle Times would be like, okay, I guess do something else then, right? There's just certain requirements in the work that we do and in the society that we are. The other thing though that I'm thinking about is even if people do leave Seattle, if they're still connected to Washington or any other community by that matter, we're still connected to each other. That's kind of the whole point of, not the whole point, but part of the issue with this disease, that we can still get each other sick, even if we're not directly living. But if we're visiting for Thanksgiving or visiting for someone's birthday, if I want to go see manatees in Florida, these are all things that I have to think about. And I'm always just frustrated with communities when we don't remember, we are intricately connected to each other. That is just what we've learned the last year and a half. Your choices affect me, my choices affect you, even if they're really small ripples down the river.
Still connected with each other. We're socially distanced again this week, but we'll be back in the same room eventually on Week in Review. That was Esmy Jimenez, the mental health reporter at the Seattle Times. We've got Publicola's Paul Keifer and Crosscut's Knute Berger. And when we come back, we're going to talk about people detained in this state and what rights and responsibilities they have. And that's coming up when we continue here on the Week in Review. You can watch the whole thing unfold if you're on YouTube or Facebook. Just search KUOW Public Radio. And I'm Bill Radke. We'll be right back.
Support for KUOW comes from Clover, a point-of-sale solution for traditional contactless and mobile payments that also provides merchants with apps and tools to help grow their business. Businesses can put products online, manage employee schedules, and more. Learn more at clover.com/we-do-that.
Prior to Trump, most of the criticism I got was for working too much across the aisle. And I don't consider myself a partisan.
Adam Schiff reflects on an unsettling 4 years in Washington, D.C. on Speakers Forum Sunday night at 7 or streaming and podcasting now at kuow.org/speakers.
Support for KUOW comes from Live Nation, presenting the Eagles Hotel California Tour, performing their album Hotel California from beginning to end. Climate Pledge Arena on Friday, November 5th and Saturday, November 6th. Tickets available now at Ticketmaster.com.
It's 12:44, and this is KUOW's Week in Review.
This week, a federal jury ordered a private prison operator to pay immigration detainees minimum wage for cooking and cleaning at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. Washington State has been suing the prison company on behalf of detainees. An advocate on this, Mauro Villapando, says that thousands of people who worked at this detention center are owed and deserve back pay.
People don't have sentences. You don't know how long you're going to be in detention while you fight your case to stay in the country. And there's absolutely nothing to do. So people end up working just to pass the time or because they actually need money. Being detained is expensive.
Esmy, you've been in that detention center and have followed this case. Paul is too. What else should we understand about this to understand this case, Esmy?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I remind people is that immigration, unlike the carceral system, right, is not supposed to be punitive. People there are not being held on criminal charges. If they were, they would be in prison, right, or they would be in jail. So they're actually on administrative or civil charges. The second thing is that this is a private prison contractor. It's not the same thing as the Washington DOC, like the Department of Corrections, right? They're very different. So to me, it's been interesting because this started 3 years ago. So to finally see this actually come to an end is really interesting. Yeah, I'll say for now.
Yeah. Paul, will this prison operator, the Geo Group, have to pay back wages, damages? Do we know?
That's the judge is still considering. This is in still kind of unresolved thread in federal district court, and there's also a class action lawsuit filed at the same time that was pushing for the exact same thing, which is back pay for detainee workers who were not paid minimum wage since the Geo Group began operating the Tacoma facility in 2004, and also some form of reimbursement for Tacoma community members for whom it was supposed to, the facility was supposed to act as a source of employment. And then the Geo Group began shifting civilian jobs to detainee workers to save money. So there's, they are also included as sort of victims of this in this case.
That's very interesting. You're as you use the word victim, because they're undercutting your job opportunities just as a citizen there, or a resident there. Yeah.
Which is a complaint that comes up, around the Department of Corrections private-public partnership, which is called Correctional Industries too. I mean, it's arisen around the issue of detainee labor in private prisons, in immigration detention centers, and all kinds of things. But the other thing to remember here is that the processing center in Tacoma is in all likelihood on its way out by 2025. The legislature voted, and Governor Inslee voted for Governor Inslee signed legislation during the last legislative session to end the use of private prisons and detention centers in Washington. And the only thing that actually applied to was the facility in Tacoma. Geo Group is suing the state to try and prevent the implementation of that law, but they lost a similar suit that is now in appeals in California. California moved to close all private detention centers in the state, and a judge sided with California when Geo Group argued that the state was undercutting federal authority. So in any case, it looks like the detention center in Tacoma might close within 4 years anyway, which would mean that everyone who's in it would have to move to other ICE facilities. But
Esmy, didn't you reported for KOW on the sort of the hardship for detainees and families of that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. People will get moved, and then they will be, in completely another state, if not thousands or hundreds of miles away from their family members. Obviously, during the last year and a half, there are no in-person visitations, so they're very much limited to what we're doing now. But that will certainly be an issue as well.
And the only place anywhere close by that would be able to take, assuming that all of California's, private facilities close, the only place that will remain open that is close is the Yuba County, California jail, which has 220 beds. There are an average of 840 people in the facility in Tacoma on a given night. So, people will not be moving to California or Oregon. It'll be a lot further away than that.
Okay, so minimum wage at least $13 something an hour instead of $1 to do the laundry and cleaning and food service and all that. Knute, anything to add on the topic?
No, I have the trouble with the public or private institutions exploiting prisoners or detainees, and especially in the private sector. I mean, there's no excuse for not paying these people wages that you would pay otherwise. So I hope they get their back pay. And, I think work in prison, should be rewarded. I don't think, I think we've just reinvented people working on the rock pile as a form of punishment in a way I just don't think is appropriate.
We were talking about the detention center, but when it comes to prison inmates, Paul, will you tell us, some inmates have had to stop doing their jobs because they're not vaccinated for COVID? How does that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, to address the minimum wage thing, it's true that this court decision doesn't apply to the Washington Department of Corrections. It doesn't apply to public institutions. So in any case, on to what you're mentioning now. Yeah, I'll be putting out a story shortly on this. Kind of almost retroactively, the Department of Corrections realized that the state's vaccine mandate applies to a portion of incarcerated workers, people who work on crews for the Department of Natural Resources to, do trail preparations for fire season, that kind of thing, to people who work in correctional industries jobs. That's the kind of spans from, making furniture to cooking food and doing laundry, who have work off site. So I don't have an exact number from the DOC yet about how many people this will impact, but for the time being, anyone who isn't fully vaccinated and fits that description is on the kind of prison equivalent of leave until, and they have until December 13th to get fully vaccinated, or else they lose that position. This means that there's kind of a de facto vaccine requirement to go to one of the Department of Corrections work camps right now. But it's a bigger deal because the DOC is, as you know, scaling down the number of people in prison and moving people to work release facilities or to home monitoring. And that means even more interactions with the community. The vaccination rate in custody is, relatively high compared to the country, but relatively low compared to like DOC staff. So like 92% of DOC staff are vaccinated. And I think it's somewhere around 77% of people in custody are vaccinated. So there are risks that come with moving people into greater contact with community, especially because the number of work release facilities isn't growing. So they're just adding new bunks to the existing work release facilities. So, it does matter to get people vaccinated right now, given that upcoming shift.
Publicola's Paul Keifer there. We're with the Crosscut's Knute Berger, the Mossback, and Seattle Times, Esmy Jimenez. This is the final week in review here before Halloween on Sunday, followed by Dia de los Muertos on Monday. And Esmy, you were telling us about a way to observe Dia de los Muertos digitally this year.
Absolutely. I thought it was really cool. The LA Times actually has this lovely project where you can go in and add a frame, you can upload a photo, and honor somebody that's passed away in your life. To me, it's something that I did growing up physically with my family members. We would set up a little altar. We would get the little orange flowers, the cempasúchiles, which if anyone knows where some of those are, please let me know. I've been looking for more and I can't find them. Some bun, some bread, and candles. And so to me, it was always really meaningful, specifically because we also had one where there would be a day for la anima sola, so the lonely soul. The idea that for people who maybe don't have any family members that remember them that are still living or who honor them, we also set up something for them as well. And I think this past year, thinking on a lot of the people that have lost somebody during COVID, that's something that I've also been like, I would like to honor that as well. So I've just been telling people, check that out. It's a really cool way. And the really intimate things that people talk about with who they remember, their mother. I saw one that was I miss my grandmother. What would I do to hear your voice again or to give you a hug? And I was like, oh, I'm tearing up.
Yeah, I like the videos and the quotes. It made me want to see short. It was photos and quotes. It made me want to see short videos of those folks. It's a
absolutely
great idea. In the I'm sure that Dia de los Muertos will be observed in the metaverse, which this week Facebook said its new parent company name is Meta Platforms because it's so devoted to the future of gathering virtually using your avatars and VR headsets and augmented reality glasses. So I wondered what's the first thing you're going to do in the metaverse? Any idea? You're shaking your head again. We're back to bomb cyclone with you, I think.
Well, first of all, when you describe, putting on VR goggles and stuff. I think when I was at Eastside Week in 1990, we put on a party that featured the same stuff. I mean,
yes.
Think about it, that's kind of antique. And the other thing I keep thinking about is, you can argue about whether there should be billionaires or not, but we have so many billionaires that are just, guys who have grown up on science fiction who are now spending your money and vast sums on recreating this childhood fantasy. And so much of these fantasies are worlds that you would not really want to live in. I mean, whether it's Game of Thrones or Dune, they're things where they're kings and queens and people ruling by blood and, and everything. And I just don't trust the world that, the Facebook folks are trying to create or recreate. And so the first thing I would do is look for an exit.
Esmy, how about you? First thing you're doing in the metaverse?
I would definitely look. I'm dumb and curious, and so I'd be like, all right, what's going on? What's happening here? I guess I would go see exactly what like a social outing would be like. Can we have parties in the metaverse? Are we all just going to be little emojis, fake drinking, like, or getting real intoxicated? I don't even understand how exactly that would function, but I would try it for at least 2 minutes, and then I would probably do what Knute did and be like, "That was good for me. I got a taste. I'm good."
Things you wish you could do in real life. So if it's partying, I would probably take naps in the metaverse. I don't do enough of that in real life. So yeah, Paul, what about you?
I'm with Knute. I am increasingly a Luddite, and I think it is, of all the cat toys that Facebook could throw at us to try and distract us right now, this really falls short. You know, I like if they had offered to ship every household in America, you know, a crate of an interesting new variety of apple, like I might have fallen for that. But at the moment, you know, I would need, with the exception that I need to use the limited amount of Facebook contact I have to reach some sources. I'm very happy to stay in my actual swamp and avoid the metaverse as much as I possibly can.
It's like Zuckerberg's like, well, I've already screwed your democracy. Come to this.
Yeah.
Take other society.
Y'all are missing out. I'm going to take frequent naps in the metaverse. Is it quiet there? Do they have leaf blowers in the metaverse or that are going to wake me up?
They have traffic. They have mosquitoes. It's terrible.
I'm going to work out a lot in the metaverse because I don't do enough of that in real life. I'm going to be virtually ripped. I'm going to compete for the title of Mr. Metaverse. Yes, Paul.
There's upcoming city council legislation to do away with at least some leaf blowers. So you might be able to get that in the universe soon, hopefully.
In real life.
Real universe.
All right. I need metaversal healthcare. Okay, we're right at the end of the show here. I want to thank my guest, Seattle Times mental health reporter Esmy Jimenez, Publicola's police accountability reporter Paul Keifer, and Crosscut editor-at-large and host of the Mossback's Northwest. That's where I want to be, the Mossback verse, Knute Berger. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill.
Real pleasure, Bill.
Me.
Great to see you. Great to see you and hear you. And thank you so much to Sarah Leibovitz and Alec Cowan, who produced this program. Thank you for the social media support and the live streaming from Tio Popescu and Juan Pablo Chiquiza. And thank you for listening on a pre-Halloween, pre-Dia de los Muertos edition of Week in Review, pre-election deadline. Get out there and vote, mail it, take it to the stuff box, and we'll see you again in a week. We're going to have a lot to talk